Unconventional foods people ate during the Civil War. Back then, even without war, the food options were probably a lot less than we have today, that's for sure. But if you add war on top of that, which, like, all of the supply lines that food typically came in, like produce and stuff, probably weren't available, like, the options must have been so thin.
Finding sufficient food supplies wasn't always easy. Blockades and barricades prevented access to necessary provisions, while the country experienced a labor shortage as farmers went off to join the fight on either side. So, Civil War soldiers and their civilian counterparts did what anyone would do when confronted with a similar situation. They improvised and did the best they could with what they could find. Today on Weird History, we're exploring a sampler of the unconventional foods people ate during the Civil War. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other historical menus you would like to hear about. Okay, let's dig in. Civilicious. Everyone loves a good cup of joe. In a content analysis of Civil War-era letters, one historian noticed the word coffee appeared more often in correspondence than words like war, slavery, and Lincoln.
Wow. So people, like, coffee was like top of the priority list for a lot of people back then.
There was a significant disparity in the way both sides discussed the brew. Union soldiers talked about how they prepared coffee. Soldiers from the South were more likely to discuss their lack of real coffee and what they did to simulate the beverage. Before the Civil War, coffee was a staple in most households. But during the war, it became a luxury. Both Union and Confederate soldiers drank plenty of coffee whenever possible. The problem was, a decent cup of mud wasn't always available. So soldiers improvised.
Why is coffee called mud, sometimes? I've heard that before. Is it just because of the color, that brown color, or is there something else to it?
Brewing coffee from peanuts, chicory, grains, and apples. Some of them got a bit more creative, using acorns or sweet potatoes. Per General J.E.B. Stuart, sweet potato coffee wasn't hard to make. To make sweet potato coffee, soldiers peeled and cut the potatoes into chunks, approximately the same size as a coffee berry. Then they placed the pieces into the sun to dry. Once dried and parched brown, soldiers ground them to the consistency of coffee grounds. After that, it was merely a matter of mixing the grounds with water until it became a pasty substance.
But did it have the same amount of caffeine in it than a coffee bean, like the sweet potato?
A bit of hot water and brewing transformed the concoction into a beverage the soldiers could enjoy with their breakfast. The coffee disparity affected the South, and they sometimes referred to their makeshift coffee concoctions as Lincoln coffee, over the outlandish brewing methods and ingredients. Coffee was an essential commodity to both sides, and sometimes soldiers received unique coffee recipes or brews from home. When General George Pickett received a new blend from his wife, he remarked, "No mocha or java ever tasted half so good as this rye sweet potato blend." Okay, George, whatever you say.
But to be fair, the sweetness of the sweet potato probably gave the coffee a natural sweetness that you didn't have to add too much sugar to. I actually want to try it. I wonder if you can buy it from anywhere, like sweet potato coffee that's already been processed, that you just need to put in you could just add water to it immediately.
The Army intended for their rations to only
Have any of you guys ever tried it? If so, what's it like?
last 3 days on an active campaign. Unfortunately, fresh meat often spoiled or became infested with flies shortly after the soldiers received it. So the Army pickled meat to make it last longer. Thus, salt beef and salt pork were born. The two types of meat were often standard rations at the time. Salt beef, otherwise known as salt horse, was described by veteran John D. Billings as thoroughly penetrated with saltpeter, often yellow-green with rust from having lain out in the brine, and when boiled, was 4 times out of 5, if not 9 times out of 10, a stench in the nostrils, which no delicate palate cared to encounter at shorter range.
I don't know, man. If food smells bad, I can't eat it. I mean, obviously, we have a lot more options available to us than, Civil War soldiers, but, if something smells awful, can you put it in your mouth? I can't do it. I can't.
Sounds delicious. Salt pork, or sow belly, didn't receive much praise either because it was usually black, rusty, and decidedly unpopular. Soldiers had to soak the pickled meats in water just to make them palatable. After that, they could be pretty versatile. Cooks might boil the meat or stew it with beans. Sometimes soldiers consumed the meat uncooked as a sort of sandwich. Of course, the sandwich bread wasn't your typical 12-grain whole wheat loaf. It was hardtack. Ultimately, Billings found the salt pork preferable to the musty and rancid salt horse. Even at that, he thought the meat was indigestible and unpalatable.
Yeah, to be fair, thinking about it, this is probably one of the only sources of protein that they had back then, especially if they were on the battlefield. So despite the horrible smell, I can see why they had to eat it.
Per the revised United States Army regulations of 1861, Union soldiers got 12 ounces of pork or bacon and a little over 1 pound of beef. Flour, cornmeal, and a pound of hard bread rounded out the provisions. On
Was that daily or what? Or monthly or weekly?
rare occasions, a soldier might get some coffee, sugar, dried fruit, or vinegar to add some flavor to their meals. Confederate soldiers, on the other hand, had a very different mess kit. The meat wasn't always available, and barricades made getting provisions to the South more difficult. To make up for the shortage, soldiers substituted a mixture of rice and molasses for the meat itself. Cooks occasionally added cornmeal to pad out the flavor. Molasses is an acquired taste, but it worked as a sweetener when Confederate troops ran out of sugar or made other foods. And you thought your lunch was rough.
I guess that's war, you know? War is horrible. Like, the conditions, the food, the infections, like, if they got an injury, back then, that was probably it, right? Like, if they got a real bad cut or something like that, they could probably lose that limb, right?
In a time when we can have meals delivered straight to our homes, Civil War recipes may seem strange. Take the case of a dish called slosh, for instance.
Slosh.
Made from a volatile combination of bacon, grease, and flour, slosh was a bacon lover's dream come true. It was also a necessity in the South, where food supplies weren't always great. Slosh was economical and easy to prepare. Soldiers took a significant amount of grease, added some bacon, and poured in watered-down flour. They'd proceed to stew the mixture until the liquid disappeared to create a thicker dish. Alternate versions of slosh, with colorful names like Confederate Kush, included beef and crumbled cornbread to create a more robust meal. Then there was slapjack, the pancake-style version of the recipe that featured a flour paste browned on both sides. It's probably not something you'd order at the local diner, but it'd probably go great with some raspberries and syrup.
Yeah, it looks just like a pancake, but with some meat in there. To be fair, that's not a bad idea. A pancake where you chop up bits of bacon and like sprinkle it in, that would actually be really tasty.
While the North had an abundance of food during the war, some foods like chocolate were essentially unavailable in the South. But a craving for chocolate and some ingenuity led to creating a drink that resembled everyone's favorite winter beverage. We don't mean Starbucks' discontinued gingerbread latte. We're talking about good old-fashioned hot chocolate. Only this version of the drink uses peanuts as a substitute for delicious confection. As it would come to be known, peanut chocolate was essentially a sugary drink made from milk and peanuts. In the 1905 book, A Belle of the 50s, Memoirs of Mrs. Clay of Alabama, provided a brief historical account of how people made peanut chocolate at the time. Our chocolate was made in this wise. Peanuts, or pinders or goobers, as they were variously called, were roasted and the skins slipped off. They were next pounded in a mortar. When blended with boiled milk and a little sugar, a sparing use of this most costly luxury was also necessary, the drink was ready for serving, and we found it delightful to our palates. It wasn't Swiss Miss, but it was good enough.
Peanut chocolate. To be fair, peanut works so well with chocolate, so that maybe without having the actual chocolate in there, if you processed it a certain way, you might get some kind of chocolate-esque flavor. But I don't know, you'd have to do a lot to it. I'm trying to think of how you can make peanut taste like chocolate. It'd probably involve like loads of processing, a bunch of sugar, obviously.
Sadly, other culinary developments will forever overshadow peanut chocolate's place in history. Per the National Peanut Board, peanuts grew even more popular in the North after the war, and by 1884, peanut butter came along to change culinary history for the better.
Yeah, peanut butter is just like Man, it works with so many different things. It's just so versatile.
While coffee alternatives were all the rage during the Civil War, what about America's other favorite beverage? Tea. It had its fair share of imitation recipes too. Tea was actually more scarce than coffee. What was a soldier to do when 4 p.m. rolled around? They improvised from some incredibly unique sources. Soldiers from both sides began brewing tea from currant, sassafras tree bark, and huckleberry bushes. For that extra zing, they occasionally used corn or bran. Yeah, nothing like a relaxing cup of corn in the evening.
Corn, man. Corn. I only realized this recently, but corn is in so many things, and you can turn it into so many things. Like you can get high fructose corn syrup, corn meal, corn bread. Like there's just so many things you can do with corn.
For the more refined palate, there was beef tea. Folks brewed the tea by putting chopped beef into a pot of boiling water to create a tea. The tea saw use in military hospitals as a potential medicine, but if some of the accounts from the time are any indication, most patients refused to drink it. In times of low or reduced sugar supplies, people turned to various sweetener alternatives. Soldiers turned to our viscous friend molasses for relief. But
How is molasses made?
sometimes even it wasn't readily available. So what did they do to satisfy their sweet tooths instead? They turned to watermelon syrup. It is exactly what it sounds like. The syrup found a place as a sugar substitute alongside sorghum and persimmons. If you want to try this sweet syrup today, it's pretty straightforward to make. Simply puree 4 cups of seedless watermelon, add a cup of sugar, then simmer it until it becomes a syrup reduction. Let it cool, put it in the fridge, and serve it as a tasty dessert topping.
Wow.
If watermelon syrup is
You know what? On pancakes, I reckon that would be a winner.
your thing, then you could prepare watermelon rinds as preserves. Preserving watermelon rinds in this manner actually dates to before the Civil War. An 1858 issue of the popular magazine Godey's Lady's Book contained a recipe for preserved watermelon rind. The recipe called for soaking watermelon rind in salt water, alum water, and clean water for 3 days apiece, followed by changing the water each day to prevent weird flavors.
Wow. The amount of things you can do, and with creativity, turning watermelon into sugar, some sugar alternative. I would never have thought of that. But I suppose if something's got a bit of sweetness to it, I guess if you concentrate down the flavor, you could get like a sugar substitute. I mean, what are the craziest things that have been turned into like a sugar substitute? Is there can you turn chicken into a sugar substitute? Probably.
The most common staple of a soldier's diet was probably hardtack. Made from salt, flour, and water, it was more like a cracker than bread. The 3x3 cracker was half an inch thick and sturdy. It was so hard that soldiers often dipped it in coffee or tea to make it edible.
Soften it. Wow.
But that wasn't the only reason. Soldiers occasionally referred to the cracker as worm castles because hardtack tended to harbor insects.
Oh my God.
Dipping it in hot coffee helped drive out the bugs, which the soldier would skim off the coffee pot and then proceed to eat the cracker. According to Army of the Potomac soldier John Davis Billings, eaten in the dark, no one could tell the difference between infested hardtack and hardtack that was untenanted.
Oh my God, that is so gross. Ugh. Ugh. I know that bugs have high protein, but I'm sorry, I could never eat a cockroach. Could you? Ugh. I suppose if you're desperate enough.
Hardtack also had problems with mold due to storage issues, and other times it was so hard soldiers had to break it with the butts of their muskets.
Jeez.
But it was inexpensive, nutritious, and simple food that kept the men fed during the long war.
Man, I just hope that there's, not another world war, because just the conditions, like if you're fighting a war, like even today, the rations that you get on the front, it's not going to be like the food that you would eat at home. It just isn't, is it?
Not to be confused with a timid or feeble person, or the song
Aside from the fact that war is obviously horrible,
by the band Helmet, Civil War milquetoast was just another way to mix the essential parts of a soldier's diet into something tastier. On its own, hardtack is kind of bland. By soaking it in condensed milk, soldiers benefited from added flavor to make the bread more palatable. It wasn't cheap either. Condensed milk cost upwards of 75 cents per can, so only a recruit with money to burn probably did it that way. Milk toast may have been creative, but it wasn't the only solution for making hardtack taste better. Soldiers reached into their sugar rations to improve the taste and occasionally made hardtack pudding. They'd pound the hardtack into powder, add water and flour to create a crust, then bake it with any fruit they had on hand.
Dude, creativity. Like, when people are desperate, they can come up with some really, creative ways to make things better or just, improve food.
Like everything else during the period, fresh vegetables were a bit hard to come by. Soldiers occasionally received carrots, onions, celery, and greens in cube form. The veggies were chopped, mixed, and pressed into cubes for use as a portable source of vitamins and fiber. Desiccated vegetables were revolting veggie cubes. Some soldiers reviled them and gave them a different name: desecrated vegetables. Desiccated vegetables provided some flavor for soups and stews. And when better fare like beans, potatoes, or rice wasn't available, desiccated vegetables took their place.
Wow.
Although reviled by most, the cubes helped ward off scurvy and other disorders related to vitamin deficiencies. At any rate, it's still better than canned spinach. Not good.
Man, I can't imagine eating a clump of rotting vegetables. I mean, yeah, I guess if you have to, but willingly, could you? Seeing what they look like, ugh.
The cooking methods employed by some members of the volunteer regiments greatly troubled U.S. Sanitary Commission member James M. Sanderson. Sanderson wasn't happy with their injurious and unwholesome mode of cooking and believed he could do it better. Sanderson began experimenting with different cooking methods, developing more efficient ways to use campfires and cooking pots in the process. Not only that, he advised cooks to limit their use of fat, sugar, and salt in their cooking. Sanderson, not one to spill the beans completely, also advised cooks to avoid overboiling beans as they cooked. Sanderson left an impressive legacy of recipes in his wake. Over 18 stews, soups, and other recipes burst from his imagination, including commissary Brazilian stew. The primary ingredient in this particular dish was vinegar-dipped cubed beef. Cooks stewed the meat with onions and simmered it over low heat for several hours. If diners were lucky, they might get some potatoes too.
To be fair, this dish compared to the other things like the desecrated vegetables sounds like pretty much might as well be steak and lobster,
What a meal.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good to be fair.
When it came time to do some cooking, folks got creative with their ingredients and cooking methods. Thus, different kinds of cakes were born. Water cakes were made by lightly beating eggs with cold water to form a thick batter. Cooks would add a touch of salt and bake it, then serve it with butter. Don't like eggs? Then try an ash cake, the eggless alternative to the water cake. Instead of flour, these cakes were made with cornmeal and boiling water, then wrapped in corn husks and cooked beneath hot ashes. Cooking methods fundamentally altered the dish. If cooked in a pan, it became a hoe cake, and if it was oven cooked, the result was a dish called pone.
Wow. I guess, the carbs would give the soldiers some energy, wouldn't it? It would keep them active. Even though it doesn't look that pleasant, just the filling nature of it would probably just do the job, wouldn't it?
Delicious pairing of pork and boiled corn was an everyday meal in the South. Known as hog and hominy, it was often served with waffles at breakfast or potatoes and greens at supper time.
Dumpling these things, don't they? like a fried sort of beef patty.
An otherwise dismal menu. As a deep-fried patty rolled in pastry or breadcrumbs, rissoles could potentially contain any kind of meat. They were like the Hot Pocket of the Civil War. But unlike the modern-day Hot Pocket, rissoles are more edible and delicious. Minced meat, fish, clams, and oysters mixed with egg were all common fillings. Ingredients were mixed with cayenne pepper and other spices, formed into cakes and fried.
Now, this is what I'm talking about. This is actually something that I would eat, for sure. Like, this looks good.
If you want to relive
Yeah, I mean, for me, the options that I would pick are definitely the either hog and himini or the last one, the fried beef patty. The desecrated vegetables just did not look good at all, and it just gives me another level of respect for the soldiers involved in this conflict because, you know, like fighting in itself is just a horrible thing to do, you know. And then when you haven't even got nice food to keep morale high, that's just it adds a whole different level of difficulty of you know, because for me, like, I look forward to, you know, a nice lunch and a nice dinner because, you know, it adds a thing to look forward to in the day. So to, you know, go through all of that fighting to know that I'm going to have a bowl of corn, you know, and some desecrated vegetables to eat for dinner. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.